Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, welcome back to another installment of the Apollo Case Study Series. I'm joined by Dr. Jim Moore. And Jim, you've brought a whole host of people back on the show, and a new face as well. So I'm going to let you handle some introductions and then set the table for our discussion this morning.
Well, we have our DRO dream team here. Most of our listeners will remember Christina Nylander and Lauren Elliott from previous podcasts, but I'm proud to also introduce a newer member to our Apollo team. Lydia Lindsey joined us from a previous position all the way in Louisiana and came and joined us and jumped right in. And kind of how we got here was Christina had us once again, kind of our jack of all trades of Apollo has yet again moved location. So she is in a different clinical location now than she was the last time she was on the podcast. And Lydia took over Christina's previous caseload. And Lauren being the clinical director of that particular location, Lydia inherited a little guy with some pretty serious elopement. And we're really excited to talk about our use of differential reinforcement of other behavior as we kind of talk about today's case studies, which has now kind of grown into evaluation of this procedure with some other clients showing some similar behaviors. So Lydia, why don't you just introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell us, we always like to say, how did you kind of fall into behavior analysis? How did you become a BCBA? And tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lydia Lindsey. I actually got into ABA in college. So I went to Auburn for my undergrad, War Eagle. I started off I was a rehabilitation and disability studies major and a psychology minor because my nephew was actually diagnosed with autism. And I saw as he was growing up, he didn't have access to early intervention services. And it really made me passionate about wanting to do something about it and wanting to help better the lives of others around me. So I know I wanted to do something in psychology, but I wasn't sure what. So I started getting involved in research and I actually got into the ABA lab on campus. And I started doing literature reviews and I fell in love with the field. I loved learning about it. I came back asking for more articles and had more questions and wanted to get more involved. So they were like, you should go to our grad program here. So I ended up getting my master's from Auburn as well. And I became a BCBA. And then I started my first job in Louisiana, as Dr. Moore said. And I'm working as a BCBA now, my 2.5 years now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I should echo the War Eagle. Yeah, that's super cool.
That's now 2 Auburn alumni you've had on the podcast from Apollo. So
there we go.
We love our Auburn graduates.
Yeah. Hope that the team in Thatch Hall keeps sending folks your ways.
Well, and what I love about, Auburn really should be, if it's not already, should be considered among those legacy programs that we often talk about in our field because, as you know, Jim Johnston got that going a long time ago. Led to one of the older state conferences or state organizations in the country with Al-Aba. But what we really love about Lydia is just how much she has embraced our approach to client-oriented research and really using the steps of scientific problem solving in all aspects of making client decisions. And this particularly is a topic I love because my involvement as chief clinical officer was not really all that much. This is an intervention approach, differential reinforcement of other behaviors I've used throughout my career, even though I hear many BCBAs say, hey, I've never used a DRO before and don't really understand it. But this team of 3 kind of conceptualized this all on their own and brought Kristen and me in at the end just to kind of go, yeah, thumbs up. Look how great these data look. So I kind of felt like I was more of a cheerleader throughout this whole process than having very much conceptual input.
Jim, from a leadership perspective, that sounds like a pretty good win in my book.
Oh, it's a dream. It's what I would love to have happen, is that, as Christina is one of our BCBAs I've mentored the longest on the Apollo team. And just to see that growth from where like every single thing we would talk about every single day when she was here in Johns Creek. Now it's like, It's more, she informs me, hey, look what I'm doing and look at these awesome outcomes. And it's like, wow, I would love to have my job be that easy all the time, just so I could just clap and say, you're awesome and you rock and you've made a life better. And so to add a member like Lydia to that and have them working with just such an outstanding leader like Lauren, it's really a delight. And, again, makes my job very, very enjoyable. And I love it because they use DRO. DRO is something I've used throughout my career. And I also use it when people kind of get uppity about our terminology and a little dogmatic and want to argue some of the things that they don't maybe agree with that we use. And I'll do it to you, Matt, because we've talked about this before. Differential reinforcement of other behavior. How does it demonstrate the principle of reinforcement?
Yeah, I mean, how many people have argued over that for sure? Is it like I think I texted you what is the Dick Malot's conceptualization? It's like punishment by pushing off the availability of the reinforcer. I'm doing a terrible job paraphrasing that, but
it's punishment by the prevention of a presentation of a reinforcer.
There you go. Much better stated. Yeah.
And so, and people will get really, like, well, it's reinforcement. It's like, well, let's go to Java and let's pull up every DRO article that's ever been published and see if we can find a graph that shows us a behavior that's increasing. And you won't be able to do it because it's really not technically, in my opinion, a reinforcement procedure. But it's so useful. It's easier, in my experience, for caregivers and teachers to use. And we're talking both as DRO as a formal intervention, as we'll talk about today, but I've also, in my own personal clinical career, used DRO schedules as a way to transition kids in early intervention off very dense FR schedules, eventually VR schedules, and then transition them to DRO schedules, which, in my opinion, more closely mirror the natural environment than interval schedules do. And they're easier for technicians to handle rather than some of the complex things that come with interval schedules, especially variable interval schedules. So I love DROs. I think also is so interesting if you look at Claire St. Peter's work over the years, there's been a lot of interesting discoveries she's had with DROs, so that DRO, if it comes to omission errors, meaning someone just forgets part of a DRO procedure, it kind of seems like this intervention's a little, resistant to low treatment integrity, up to, in one study, as low as 60% still seemed to produce results. And, over time, you tend to see integrity decrease. So it gives us some hope that a DRO procedure might be something that lay people can use effectively.
So it's forgiving is what you're saying. It's
yes,
yeah,
it's more forgiving than some of our other procedures.
I know you do teaching as well, Jim, and I'm curious what your, when you bring up DROs to not only your clinical team, but also students that you've taught over the years. I can imagine people, might raise their hand and say, well, Dr. Moore, what about all this awesome research and, functional communication training, skills-based training, and things like that? Is DRO this, kind of crude old school thing that, maybe should be, best examined in the rearview mirror of our science? What would you say to something like that?
It's interesting. I meet once a month with our behavior technicians who are enrolled in graduate school. And we talked not necessarily about DRO, but we talked about contrived contingencies and the varying degrees of how contrived a contingency can be. And I was surprised to see how many of our graduate students had not ever really been told, hey, what we're doing is we're building contingencies that don't exist and using contrived reinforcement. I think that there, on one side, what I would say is you could look at DRO perhaps as maybe more crude and not as elegant as FCT. I want to give, major recognition to one of my mentors, Wayne Fisher, kind of the guru of FCT, and learned it right from him. So I know how effective that intervention can be. Or you could say, is DRO less contrived and more approximates what parents may do in response to their child? Because what I've seen over the years is parents are going to respond to problem behavior. much more frequently and much more effectively than appropriate behavior. Now, we, of course, are going to tell them, hey, we need to pour on the praise, pour on the reinforcement for appropriate behavior. But in terms of what signals them to act, they're already have a history of acting in the presence of problem behavior. So one way I think you could look at DRO is we're just kind of sliding into what they're already naturally doing by responding, because when you activate the contingency of DRO, it's in response to the target behavior, so problem behavior. And so perhaps rather than being old school or clunky or it's more naturalistic and a little less contrived.
Okay.
I don't know. I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, it just occurred to me when you brought up the topic. I wanted to throw that out there as a discussion point. But more importantly, though, you guys just did a presentation at a state conference. You've got some good cases to talk about. So let's turn this from a more conceptual to a more practical angle here, and hear about some of the clients that you guys have helped.
Yeah. So Lydia, why don't you tell us? We'll just take a moment and introduce. We're going to try and talk about. We actually have 3 clients going through this protocol now, and we do intend to try and disseminate these results through publication. But we're going to try. We probably only have time to talk about 2 of them, and one is a case Lydia is overseeing, and one is a case Christina is overseeing. So Lydia, just take us and tell us the high points, the important things to know about your client that went through this procedure.
Yeah, absolutely. So our client, he's a 7-year-old male diagnosed with autism with an accompanying intellectual and language impairment level 2. And he started ABA when he was about 3 years old. He stopped for a few years there after COVID and then started at Apollo about 7 months ago. His DRO included 7 behaviors, included physical aggression, self-injurious behavior, elopement, spitting, climbing, property destruction, and pica. They were all hypothesized to serve the same function of attention and escape from demands.
So let's talk about that just for a second, because when I first kind of got consulted with this particular case, it was elopement. And then one of the things that really, I think, confirmed for us, and Lauren, I think you and I had this discussion, as we started to see as he contacted DRO contingencies for elopement, well, then we saw this, and then we saw this, and then we saw this, which is indicative of a behavioral chain of functionally equivalent responses. So what did that kind of, you might not even recall, is how that progression unfolded, and what kind of decisions and how quickly did you make them to fold new behaviors as they emerged into this package?
Absolutely. So when we started with the DRO, we actually had protesting included in the behaviors that stopped the DRO timer. So over time, we saw the very first day he was testing what started and stopped the timer. He was engaging in a lot of different behaviors, looking back to see how the clinician responded. And he actually had not engaged in pica at all in the clinic before we started the DRO. And so once we implemented it, we did see him test different contingencies. However, that is a previous behavior that he had engaged in. It just re-emerged after we started the DRO. So after we waited at least 3 days to see a consistent pattern, and we actually waited until we faded to the 10-minute interval. So it was a few weeks before we modified the DRO. But at that point, we had seen his responding not stay below the criteria level that we had set for at least 3 days. And we decided to remove protesting from the DRO because that is more age appropriate and it was a less intense behavior. But pica was a lot more severe, and we wanted to include that in the DRO to definitely get that behavior down. And then we also modified the reinforcement contingency at that point as well.
And for the listener, I know that we're already kind of jumping ahead and making some allusions to methodology. Once we get through kind of the client backgrounds, we'll backtrack and really go over exactly the points of the methodology that are important to know. But Christina, tell us a little bit about your client.
Yeah, my client is 6 years old, also diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Again, also been in ABA since he was 3 years old, but has only been in Apollo for the last year. And the maladaptive behavior we're targeting for him is specifically self-injurious behavior in the form of biting his own hand.
And obviously, one of the one of the big ticket items, we've got several behaviors there for both kids that are kind of what I always bring up to our team is like, hey, there's a few things that kids can do that can really cause harm to themselves. Elopement, that's definitely a big one. Pica, that's another one. Self-injurious behavior. Those are things that could potentially even be lethal in some cases for small children. And so that's very important to intervene on. But even more importantly, for a practice like Apollo, which is mainly focused on early intervention, these behaviors are causing massive barriers to skill acquisition, right? So we're doing good work. We're trying to reduce problem behavior, but also we're kind of losing progress in terms of gaining skills. So this was very, very important to come in and intervene. So let's tell Christina, the listeners a little bit, and we'll all kind of chime in throughout this as we talk about the methodology. And just for the listeners too, this is not a study that has been done in a lab attached to a graduate school or in a research center. This is real life practice. These are DROs that are happening from the moment the child arrives at the clinic until the moment they get in the car and leave. So there's you might hear some things, and we're not here to say, hey, this is something that you might see that's tightly wound like something in Java, but we try our very best to have the client's needs always come first, but still conduct matters in a scientific way. So Christina, kind of start us off with our discussion about the methodology that's being used for both of these kids.
Yeah, so just a kind of general overview before I dive into how we actually created the protocol. The client procedures being implemented we have listed out all of the behaviors we're targeting and their operational definitions. So everyone can be on the same page of what are we actually targeting when you implement the contingencies and things like that. And then we have a board where on the top, we'll have a picture of the reinforcement that specific client is earning. And then on the bottom is a timer. And on that timer, it kind of counts down whatever interval we're currently targeting and whatever phase they're in the intervention. And when the day begins, they show them the reinforcement, they start that timer, and they deliver the reminder of the contingencies. Hey, you have to keep a calm and safe body, whatever behaviors we're looking for in order to earn such and such. And then whenever they see the maladaptive behaviors being targeted, they remove the picture, pause the timer, deliver that contingency reminder, wait for the offset of the behavior. Then they re-add the picture of the reinforcement and then reset the interval. So it's important to note that it's a resetting DRO interval. And then once we've reached the full interval in absence of the maladaptive behavior or behaviors, then we immediately provide the reinforcement for the specific schedule, again, for that specific phase. And so how we came up with the procedure, we started with taking IRT data in between each maladaptive behaviors over 3 different days, at least 3 different therapists, and at least 3 different times of days to make sure that we were collecting data that was accurate across almost the whole team or as close as we could get to the whole team, and making sure that it's across multiple days. So in case they didn't sleep well one day, there's no kind of, outliers or anything like that. Once we had a good amount of IRT data, we then went in and IRT data, I'm getting a note from Matt to explain IRT. So that is going to be inner response time. So inner response time data is when you go in, and for example, we were doing it with the maladaptive behaviors. So you're going to go into a session, wait until you see one of the behaviors, then start your timer. And then once the behavior is done, you keep your timer running and then wait until you see the next behavior and stop your timer. So now you have the amount of time on average between the maladaptive behaviors happening. The reason we want to get that data is because if you know about how long the behaviors are happening, you can then set your starting reinforcement schedule slightly below that to know, all right, we can have this client access reinforcement while teaching these contingencies and then fade the reinforcement from there.
Let me just chime in here, because this was something that I think Lauren was really crucial in helping include in this intervention. because I often see, not just with DROs, but I'll talk to BCBAs about, well, how'd you set this child's initial toileting schedule? Well, we just picked 30 minutes. Or how'd you pick the initial FCT schedule? And they don't take data on what's the likely schedule associated with problem behavior, and then how do you set up your intervention to be highly competitive, because the problem behavior already has history on its side. So it has momentum and mass. And we tend to, here at Apollo, really believe and preach that behavior is kind of like the laws of physics. So when a behavior already has momentum and mass, to change its trajectory, whatever we're doing from an intervention standpoint must have an unequal and opposing force. So one of the ways it has to be competitive is it has to be richer. Like, it has to be not only just easier to get to, but it's got to be more competitive from a schedule standpoint. So very, very crucial, I think, that use of IRT data in setting the initial DRO. Whereas I could easily see some folks say, well, let's just do 5 minutes for everybody, or let's do 15 minutes for everybody, or whatever it is, without really seeing what's our inner response time look like for problem behavior.
And we wanted to be really confident that we were, starting an initial interval, like Christina mentioned, below the average IRT, to make sure that we felt confident that we know this kid can go X number of minutes without engaging in the behavior, so that there is the opportunity to contact reinforcement and start to learn that contingency before we start to thin out the reinforcement schedule.
So from there, we then collected baseline data on a partial interval recording for 15 minutes across the entire treatment day. So we wanted to see how many 15-minute intervals is this child engaging in the behavior or behaviors. The reason we did that is, one, we wanted to keep the intervals consistent. So that way, when you're fading reinforcement, it's consistent as you're fading reinforcement. So that way you're not doing these large jumps from, okay, they're going to get reinforcement every 5 minutes, but now all of a sudden they're getting reinforcement every 20 minutes. You don't want to see that ratio strain, because you might lose the effectiveness of your intervention. So we chose the 15-minute intervals just honestly because it's easiest for the team. And we knew that we were going to be able to get accurate data, because that's a huge part of these procedures, is you want accurate data. Otherwise, you're not going to be confident that as you're fading reinforcement, that the reinforcer is going to still, maintain its effectiveness. We don't want our clients to get satiated. And we also don't want to, like I said, hit that ratio strain, and then they no longer are motivated for these contingencies. And so we collected the baseline over, depending on each client, a specific number of days. For this client specifically, we only did one treatment day, but that's because the behaviors were so severe, we needed something in place. So we collected that. We knew he was engaging in the behaviors about, Lydia, I believe it was 63% of the intervals, about 63% of the intervals throughout the day. So then we were able to say, okay, we're going to start with, again, interval slightly lower than we know that he's engaging in between the maladaptive behaviors. And we're also going to make sure that he's engaging in less than 80%, which is slightly above the baseline data, before we move on to the next treatment phase. And we had already systematically created the reinforcement fading schedule before implementing this procedure to make sure that we're not staying in one phase too long. Not only is it important to always have your reinforcement schedule ready to be faded before starting an intervention, but also because we were utilizing an electronic reinforcer, specifically Google Maps, this client's parents did not want him on a device for long periods of time throughout the day. So we had to make sure we're fading this as soon as possible to stay in line with the parents as well.
I wanted to just say one more thing about, I'm sorry I keep harping on IRT, but the flip side to what I said earlier could be, well, okay, I get that. Well, why don't we just make these ridiculously small intervals to start with? Well, our principles here, kind of in line with what you'll hear Greg Hanley talk about, is a balance of effectiveness and efficiency. And so to just assume that we're going to have to start with like a 30-second interval to start with, which means basically you're going to get absolutely nothing else done the whole day is not very effective, nor, to kind of give a shout out to our functional contextual friends, it's not very precise either, because we're really trying to design interventions that not only have breadth, but precision as well. So again, just another compelling reason why. I mean, you have those data there, the kids engaging in these behaviors. So use your data to make more precise decisions that help us balance effectiveness and efficiency.
From there, once we had all of that ready to go, we made sure that we presented it to parents, since it does include punishment principles, and it is technically partially a punishment procedure. So we wanted to gain that consent. We reviewed everything, the reinforcement fading schedule, how the procedure is going to go, and had the parents sign off on that and let them know as well at any point if they aren't happy with the procedure, they can withdraw their consent, because we want to make sure that we're including the families in everything we do at Apollo as well, and making sure we have that clear communication and buy-in. Buy-in is huge for us at Apollo, because if you don't have that, you're not going to see your treatment be effective across all locations and settings for that client. Once we gained consent from the family, we also took the time to train the team. We made sure that we did that behavioral skills training on how to implement the procedure, made sure everybody knew the operational definitions. We created cheat sheets so that way everything was in the room, very simply placed in a flow chart so the RBT could make decisions moment by moment. And then we also made sure that we supervised every single first session of the RBT and continued to supervise past the first session if needed to make sure everybody was implementing it with treatment integrity.
Let me just kind of give a shout out about integrity, because I talked earlier at the beginning of this discussion about Claire St. Peter's work and research with DRO and omission errors. That's leaving something out of the protocol. And it seems that DRO for omission errors is very durable. They also found that commission errors, which is adding something that's not part of the protocol, was actually really bad. And then in some cases, the client's problem behavior or target behavior would actually exceed baseline levels. And so really getting that training and getting everyone at that baseline level of integrity is so important. Christina, I really appreciate you mentioning how we gained that consent from parents, but also these are kids that I think we had said our first participant had been with us about 7 months, our second participant about a year. So DRO wasn't the first thing that came out of the toolbox. You know, ethically, we're going to use more reinforcement or less restrictive procedures first. So just rather than spending a lot of time delving into those, just to kind of let the listeners know that this was the result of other function-based, more reinforcement-based procedures not effectively reducing these dangerous and potentially harmful behaviors to acceptable clinical levels.
Great. I appreciate you reviewing that, just because I know when sometimes people hear, you know, the word punishment, you know, it's like, lights go off in their head and, you know, and whatnot. And so I want to, so I appreciate you making mention of that. You might have mentioned it earlier in the conversation and I missed that as well. So,
and so really, you know, we're leaving off the training. Let's talk about some minor points. So Christina, what happens? So we talked about, you've got this timer, you're doing some really good signaling of the contingencies to the client, which I think also is in line with what we have seen, signaled schedules versus unsignaled schedules, especially with individuals with disabilities. What happened when they engaged in problem behavior? Because when you talk to practitioners that say they're using DROs, you can hear a lot of variability on what happens when the problem behavior occurs.
Are you asking me before the intervention or with the DRO? Sorry.
With the DRO. So when you started, because that criterion is the same, you're changing the interval, but the consequences for engaging in problem behavior have remained consistent throughout. So what actually happened if one of our clients engaged in one of their target behaviors?
Yeah. So once you immediately see the target behavior, you're going to remove that picture, pause the timer, deliver the contingency reminder. So for example, with my kiddo with the SIB, we remind him, hey, in order to earn your whiteboard and marker, you need to have calm and safe hands and keep your hands out of your mouth. My offset is 15 seconds. So 15 seconds in absence of SIB reached, that picture is placed back on to signal the availability of reinforcement again. And then the timer reset to the current schedule that we're on, depending on the phase again.
And I think that's crucial, resetting the interval, because a lot of times what I see happen in clinics I've consulted in is, like, say that they're on a 5-minute interval and 4 minutes and 30 seconds in, the kid engages in problem behavior and they pause the timer. But when they come back, and now they maybe give a contingency reminder like you talk about, but when they come back, they just start the timer where it left off. Right. And so it really, when you think about it, when you look in the literature, typically the interval is reset. And I think that the danger that you have in not resetting the interval is behavioral variability, because now you become kind of hostage of when does the behavior, because it can now become, as we're trying to gradually fade this interval into longer periods of work, if all we're doing is pausing, now we're a prisoner to when does the behavior occur. And now how is the client going to discriminate the contingencies in the schedule, rather than it's consistently, you've got to give us this much without that behavior. So to talk about kind of the decision-making process, I think you and Lydia had some discussions I saw on Slack, and we talked also too about the determination to reset the interval rather than just pause and pick back up.
I think Lydia can best describe that.
Yeah, so for resetting the interval, we also, again, the behaviors were very severe for the client that I'm working with, and we really wanted to get these behaviors reduced as fast as possible. As also agreed with his parents, they wanted this behavior to reduce as fast as possible as well. So we figured the resetting DRO would help us do that, as well as if you don't reset the interval and he's no longer able to access the reinforcement at the end of that interval, there's no more motivation to finish that interval out. Like if you pause it at 4 minutes and 30 seconds and then he calms down and you restart it, he still doesn't earn it at the end of that 5 minutes, then he doesn't have any motivation for those last 30 seconds to continue engaging in safe and calm body. So we definitely wanted to show him that this behavior also has consequences, and that if you engage in this, it will reset the timer and go back. But like we'd already said, we did exhaust all other options before doing this.
Well, and I think, Lydia, with your client, with a possible attention component to the functional properties of the behavior, this pausing stuff for an attention to maintain kid can become what I call game playing. It's like, oh, you think you're in charge of this? Let's see. Boop, 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 boop. And it's like you're playing a video game now. Pause, stop, pause, stop, pause, stop. And I've seen this when I've consulted in clinics, to where that gameplay starts. And I hear what you're saying. It's like, yeah, but I've seen clinicians who will then still give the access to the reinforcer. So it's like, let's say we have 5 minutes. I've had to pause it at 1 minute. I had to pause it at 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I had to pause it at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The kid's obviously playing a game, but then they give you this little bit of 25 to 30 seconds with no problem behavior. Timer goes off, and then the clinician gives them access to the reinforcer. And it's like, oh my goodness. And they can't seem to figure out why there's so much variability in their data. It's like the kids playing a game with you. So it's really important, I think, to say, hey, we're in charge of this schedule, and here are the clear contingencies. We've already leveraged it through using the RT data to be advantageous compared to the schedule that's currently maintaining their problem behavior. So I think that that's a really important point for our listeners to hear, is that we are clearly resetting that, even if there's 1 second left, because, one of the other things that I read recently in one of Claire's papers is one of the worst commission errors that can happen is the delivery of the reinforcer in close proximity of problem behavior, very similar to one of the concerns that you have when using fixed or variable time delivery of reinforcers, or as normal people say, NCR.
I got to jump in here. I'm sorry, but that has to be an incredibly hard thing to coach techs to do, right? They're so close, and I can just imagine the conversation. Are you telling me I've got to he's 9 minutes and 59 seconds, or 14 minutes and 59 seconds, or whatever it might be, and you're telling me I got to do this? He was good for so long. Yet I can play the conversation in my head. I gotta hear how you coach the techs through this problem.
That was definitely difficult to talk them through, but I think what really helps is we explain the why behind everything that we do. Like, we really try to also have the clinicians buy in and not just the parents. Like, we had a team meeting before we introduced it, and we went over the purpose of the DRO. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this for this client? We let them know, like, we did have parental consent to do this. And I think getting their buy-in really makes a big difference, and they're more willing to do those harder things and to be like, and we're really invested and we want him to succeed. So it is really tough when you get to 2 seconds left in the interval and that behavior happens and you've got to stop the timer and implement the contingency. But because they were so invested in seeing his progress and seeing this behavior reduce, they also were very invested in making sure that they were implementing it exactly as they should be. And their integrity, their procedural fidelity has also been beautiful and incredibly awesome to watch. But another difficult situation is when they engage in a different behavior that is not necessarily an appropriate behavior, but it is not included in the DRO, and you still need to deliver the reinforcement for that behavior. So especially when starting the DRO with my client and he was engaging in the pica, it was really difficult to give him access to Google Maps while he had something in his mouth, but did not meet the criteria. So we needed to follow through.
But then that also kind of gets back to how important it is to have that open communication with your techs. So they say, hey, we got something else happening, because variability can happen with more than just problem behavior. I was telling a group of our new BCBAs this week, it's like, one of the things that we say is easiest that's not easy at all is maintaining the client's motivation. And your tech needs to tell you, because they see your kid more than you do. When there's shifts in the client's motivation, you need to know that as soon as possible. So that's another thing, is to have that clear and open communication. I think also, to kind of continue my infomercial on IRT, is we are setting up for success on the front end, which is something we love to do here at Apollo. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we're making it more likely that he's going to access reinforcement at first, and then just not jump. Oh, great. You did 5 minutes. Here you go. Now you got 25 minutes. No, we're incrementally and using database decision-making, gradually fading that schedule. And so I think that these instances of there's like less than 5 seconds left on the stopwatch, I'm sure we could go in and determine how many times that may or may not have happened. But my thought is it probably didn't happen quite as much as it would have if we would have been a little bit more arbitrary in picking that initial DRO interval and not being so meticulous in thinning or widening that interval.
One cool thing that I just wanted to add in about my team as they've been implementing the procedure with my client at this location is our behavior is not attention maintained. So we can make more statements. And so my team kind of took it upon themselves when that did happen. When they reset the timer, they were like, you were so close, buddy. You got it this time. And then when he got it the next time, they're just like ecstatic. They're cheering him on and the client's so excited. They still get their reinforcement, but it makes it even more reinforcing after like they were so close. And so I see the client like excited that their team really cares about them and they listen to those statements. And, you can see the upset when he's like, dang it, I did almost make it. But then after that, we go the rest of the day with no SIB. And so I think it's cool to see how your team can get so much buy-in when they see such an effective protocol.
I was just going to follow up on Dr. Moore's point about the IRT too. With the first client that we started this with, the one that Lydia has been discussing, the interval that we started with was so the average IRT for him was about 5 minutes, and we started at a 4-minute interval for him. And he flew through those initial phases. He met the mastery criteria to thin his reinforcement schedule and increase the DR interval, consistently very quickly. And so the initial thought could have kind of been like, were we too conservative? Did we start this interval too low. But I think it really, I think it actually really just proves Dr. Moore's point that we set him up to be successful. He contacted reinforcement. He learned that contingency so quickly because of that his behavior decreased really quickly, and he moved through those initial phases so fast. He's now at a 75-minute DRO interval. Is that right, Lydia? Or is it even more now? Yeah, 75 minutes, which, it's only been a matter of months since we started this. So starting off with, taking the IRT data, starting off below the average was a huge component in his success in this point.
So you think about that, we go from 4 minutes to now 75 minutes, and he is 7, correct, Lydia?
Yeah.
So he would likely be in a second grade classroom. I don't know, I've seen teachers ask students to sit for ridiculously long periods of time, but 75 minutes, that's a pretty good marker of likely success once he transitions back into the school setting. So
I'll just, say definitively no second grader sits for 75 minutes. And if they do, something's really, really wrong. So I
also want to give back to Christina's point about the team and how they're pouring praise, just to kind of give a shout out back to a previous podcast when we talked about behavior reduction, our universal protocol. This is all more evidence of how much we invest in what we call step 2 from Robert Schramm's 7 steps of instructional control, having fun and trying to condition our attention as a reinforcer. That's what we want. We eventually want them working for our attention more than the things that they're working for. So that's our team has really bought into that. We don't even use the word pairing anymore. It's rapport building and relationship building. We really want them to value people more than things. And the team, just without really us having to remind them or specifically coach them, they're just like, hey, this is part of having a good relationship with this little guy. So just in the interest of time, if we feel like we've really kind of outlined these procedures pretty clearly, Lauren kind of said our first little guy is now up to 75 minutes. Let's kind of talk about results and more importantly, how these results have created new learning opportunities for these clients. So Lydia, you want to start since yours was the first, and then we'll let Christina update us on her client. And maybe even without much background, maybe just give us a little preview about how client number 3 is progressing. But Lydia, I'll let you go first.
Okay, yeah. So first client that we put through the DRO procedure, he started with a 4-minute interval. As we said, he got 1 minute access to Google Maps, and he rocked that, moved down. We're now at a 75-minute interval with a safe and calm body. You get 3-minute access to Google Maps or Waze. He still chooses Google Maps, and his behavior is maintained at or below 14% of intervals with behavior present, which has been very exciting considering we started at about 63% of intervals. By doing that, we've been able to slowly increase his skill acquisition targets and increase the demands that we're able to place in session. So he's mastered tolerating sitting and playing at a table with a therapist present with him while playing. He's also mastered some emerging perspective taking skills from the peak relational training system, which has been very exciting because his parents really also want to make sure that he's understanding how his actions impact other people, build those empathy skills, and addressing his rigidity with his schedules, also being able to tolerate change and transitions and things like that. So it's been really exciting to see his progress as he's gone along in just a few months.
Can I just jump in here? I know people are going to be wondering about this, and if the answer somehow gives away information that we're not privy to, obviously we can defer. But what is he looking at on Google Maps? I have to know.
Everyone asks that.
And why not Waze? That's the people's GPS.
A lot of people ask. He's very interested in different aspects of Google Maps. It just depends on the day. Sometimes he'll zoom out and go all the way to Canada. Other times he stays really local and he looks at just the streets around the clinic. At some point, I learned a lot about how to use Google Maps actually from him, just watching him play with it. You can see all of the Lyft drivers as they're in town. So he would just go there and watch the cars drive around town. It's really interesting. He finds different ways, and now you can even see in his play, he lines up his cars like they're intersections on a road, and he builds his own highways and things like that. So we've actually been able to find other reinforcing activities for him by observing him engaged in this. with this activity.
There's some interesting neurological studies on London cab drivers that I'll try to put a footnote in the show notes with regard to that. So this whole idea of learning roads and things like that, maybe there's an interesting transportation engineering future for this youngster. So thank you for indulging my curiosity. I guarantee there's going to be people listening to this who have the same question.
Christina, how are your clients progressing?
Yeah, so initially the SIB occurred when he started therapy. And I think it's important to note that I presented a Chewy while I was trying to figure out why this behavior is happening. And then the behavior just went away. So like, okay, cool. He's got his Chewy. He's getting that oral input. We'll move on. So I started with the skill acquisition. He was doing really great. He actually started talking, vocal speech emerged. And then all of a sudden, about 7 months into therapy, the SIB reemerged at a pretty significant rate. It was happening on average 15 to 20 times a day, leaving rings on his hand. And I was like, okay, this is only increasing. Let's try and address it. Talked with mom, tried to do some medical rule outs. We couldn't really get clear, definitive answers. There was nothing medical going on. So then Dr. Moore and I teamed up and potentially talked about an FA. But when we were going through this, we realized we could kind of make it happen, but doing an FA honestly would increase the danger for this client, just because when we were trying to figure out our phases, we saw an increase in intensity and didn't want him to break skin. So that's when we kind of chose the DRO, because I knew that I had a competing reinforcer for him as well and could potentially motivate him to engage in other behaviors, utilize his Chewy again. He's now utilizes an AAC device. So working on those coping skills and communicating how he's feeling in the moment to better access appropriate alternative activities. And so to kind of get back to where he's at, I started this procedure about 3 weeks ago, and his data actually almost exactly aligned with Lydia's client. So I didn't have to do math. So I got to use the same intervals, same reinforcement fading schedule. And he also started on 4 minutes. And within 3 weeks, he's already at a 33-minute interval and scheduled to increase after today.
Incredible. So it's really, when a parent brings us their children, they're wanting to, of course, if they have problematic behavior, they're wanting to see that go away. But what they're really wanting to see are things that are going to significantly increase the quality of their child's life. And it's those skill acquisition, those daily living skill targets. That's really what we're wanting to do. And so I think that we could have gone down the rabbit hole. And as I remember the conversation, I was like, Christina, I've done a lot of FAs with SIB, and we can go down that rabbit hole if we really want to. But here are some of the reasons why we might not want to do that. And I know that might be controversial to some of my colleagues out there, especially ones I've done FAs with before. But, you have to really, at the end of the day, think holistically about the client's well-being and what is in the absolute best interest. Christina was very confident in her competing reinforcer, but also very confident that, that initial increase that you may see in the intensity of SIB when you first start analysis could really put the client in harm's way even more than they already are. So I think it was a very conservative and even keel approach. But we also said, hey, we're going to keep a very close eye on these data. And if we don't see similar results that we saw in Lydia's case, then we are going to quickly come in and bring in our FA methodology to design a different intervention. So
one of the things I wanted to note too, because my intervention with this child is slightly different from Lydia's, is I still maintained my rate data collection on the SIB, but I split it into two. So I still collect rate data on if the SIB occurs during the DRO interval versus the reinforcement interval. Since I didn't have a super great handle on why exactly the behavior was happening, I wanted to make sure I wasn't increasing it during those reinforcement intervals. And if I was going to have to change the procedure and add in, some things to target that. It's non-existent during the reinforcement interval now, and on average is only happening about 4 times throughout the entire day. So we've seen some significant results there.
And for our listeners, one of the reasons that's so important is, early in my career, I was dealing a lot with automatically maintained self-injurious behavior. And what you will often see is when it's not as if, I think it's a misconception. And if a child has a behavior that's maintained by automatic reinforcement, that means they're immune to socially mediated contingencies. And that's often not true. But what will often happen with an automatically reinforced behavior is it's almost as if they're using it to augment other sources of reinforcement they contact. It's like, oh, this reinforcer is really groovy. Let me make it even better by biting. And we were very concerned about that potential happening because I've just seen it throughout my career so much. So it was we had a lot of safeguards around both cases, but especially with this behavior so that we could pivot at a moment's notice. And in terms of pivoting, as we kind of start to see the clock moving, I wanted to talk with especially Lydia and Christina. But I think all three of you, you had your various reasons for joining the Apollo team, but we've heard me talk about this notion of client-oriented research since you joined the team. And now you are in the midst of doing just that. And right now everything looks great. But as I've told our team often, it's like when you are doing that client-oriented research, meaning that the needs of the client come first. The research questions are the referral concerns or the current concerns. That means that a great study can fall apart on you at a moment's notice, at the drop of a hat. So I wanted to just give a moment for each of you to talk about how this experience has been. It's looking super promising. We think we're going to have 3 cases in a multiple baseline design that can be of some use to clinicians. Not necessarily something that will tell us a whole lot more that we didn't already know about behavior, but to know how do we implement these things in real life with all the demands that we have placed on us. Like I think about Lauren and Christina and their current jobs. Well, if a toilet goes out, they've got to drop what they're doing and attend to that because they have to oversee kind of the operations of their locations. Lydia has a whole caseload, and so does Christina. So kind of take just a moment, each of you, and talk about your experience. What are the challenges of conducting client-oriented research? And maybe how does this approach differ from what you've seen in other positions you've held? Let's just go around. Let's start with Lauren, the most senior member of the group, and then we'll hear from Christina and then end with Lydia.
And, in this case, I think the impetus for starting a DRO with this first client, Lydia's client that we've talked about, it didn't start with the idea of doing research or making this potentially something for a publication. It really was, we've tried these other methods, we've tried these reinforcement procedures, nothing is working. This was kind of at the intersection of Christina transferring to another location and Lydia taking over, and where we had tried different things. And, so I came to them and said, like, these, let's try this, let's take this approach. And it was really just for clinical reasons and improving what was, happening at the clinic for this client and his family. But then as we saw that it was, worked really well and really beneficial, and then there were other clients that it seemed like this could work for, then it kind of turned into, hey, let's submit this for a presentation at GABA. And we're doing it with these 2 other clients and it's working really well too. And so I think it's kind of evolved into something that is going really well, because of our procedures that we have at Apollo. We're taking data on all of it. We're collecting IOA. We have those components already involved that do make it something that could be publishable. And I think that from my perspective, is at least it's kind of evolved into this thing that might be research oriented, but it started out from just a purely like clinical standpoint. And that's exciting. Like that evolution has been exciting. And I think that doing, as a clinician, of course, I look at Java and I look at JAB, but what I find myself really looking at for things that are actually practical is probably more like behavior analysis and practice and some of those publications that are client focused and maybe more practical for what we're doing in our day-to-day practitioner lives. So the thought of doing research with the approach that we're taking that is client focused, I think having those kind of bumps in the road that of course come along with all of these external variables that happen when you're working with a whole lot of people, clients and techs and families, make things way more realistic for other clinicians and other practitioners to learn from. And including that in research, I think, is just a more relevant approach, I guess, from what we're doing and from our perspective.
Yeah, I think that.
If I may,
go ahead, Matt.
I just want to underscore. I think that's a really good point, and I think that in terms of the relatability of the data, and one of the things that your comment made me think about is that it's the kind of thing you also see in school psychology journals as well. Sometimes you'll see things like an ABA design. Of course, we'd all want to see the B, right? That last B, that last phase, or maybe a multiple baseline across two conditions or two participants or whatever, and not three or more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are much in the same way that you folks are doing, client-oriented research. A lot of times, these are people doing research, that's part of their master's theses, their doctorate dissertations, and they're doing these in schools and other environments that bring a whole host of uncontrollable variables in it. But nonetheless, I think this is more of an emotional response, I suppose, on my part. But they tend to have a little bit more, whether you call it social validity or not. There's probably a number of ways to tack that, that experience of looking at something that's incredibly relatable like that. But I think that's a great point. And I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, and I think the two things I really hear too is, one, we found something we weren't necessarily looking for. And for the last several months, I've been really harping with our team about the place of serendipity in science. Pavlov didn't go into his lab looking to discover respondent conditioning. He was studying digestive processes of dogs. And as a good scientist, as Skinner said, when you notice something interesting, drop everything and study it. That's what we're supposed to do. And I think more importantly, what I heard in Lauren's response is, and kind of alluding back to the very first Apollo case study episode, when I talked about and convinced Matt why he should consider himself a scientist, it's not about necessarily publishing, though I think that's important. But when we allow ourselves to say we're a behavior analyst, but we're not using science in our practice, I don't think that's behavior analysis. This is a natural science approach. The principles of scientific problem solving are key to not getting a publication in a journal, but to solving our clients' problems effectively. Or else we just start throwing the kitchen sink, or we start considering perhaps things that don't have evidence behind it, or pseudoscience, or maybe mentalism to that point. So yeah, I think it just reminds me of what I always used to hear Wayne say, is if you conduct every case as if you're trying to publish it, the most important thing that will happen is better outcomes for your clients, better decisions. What I heard when I listened to Lydia and Christina describe their cases is how much more attention I heard them say went into data collection, training the team, than I think you may see in perhaps other jobs you guys held, or other places. They'll say, no, that research stuff is not for us. Well, take the word research out if you want. It's about science and the quality of the data and the fidelity of the procedures, and knowing that we're doing that good job and making that impact. So, yeah, I think that was really great. Christina, how about you? And how is this approach? Because I remember meeting you for the very first time and you say, listen, I'm not a researcher. I didn't like single case design and all these other things. And now here you are leading the charge again, just to kind of let you know, Christina's got several irons in the client-oriented research fire. One of them, when she comes back from maternity leave, is hopefully a clinical replication of Alice Schillingsberg's rapport building and demand fading protocol that we use with many clients here at Apollo. So talk to us a little bit about your perspective through this process.
Yeah. So I think, thinking back to grad school, and I went to an online program, which I know a lot of grad students are doing now. They didn't talk a lot about being a scientist in the field. Unfortunately, it was really focused, of course, on interventions and making sure you understood, the basics, but actual client application, unless you have a really great fieldwork experience, program, you don't get a whole lot of. And so I was lucky enough to find Apollo, and Apollo is a company that really heavily emphasizes in that and invests in their team to make sure that we're actually doing, parsimony, and we are, doing all these rule outs and looking at things in a scientific way, and not just, well, in grad school 5 years ago, this is what I remember. I think I've seen Lauren pull out the Cooper book more than I've ever seen another clinical director pull out the Cooper book, to be honest with you. And I have friends who have been at BCBA as long as I have that are in that role now. And so I think it's changed my perspective on who I am as a practitioner. And as I talk to my family about it too, they're like, you need to stop calling them your clients. Those are your patients, because it just gives you a better perspective on what we're doing here and how it actually affects our families that we're treating and the clients, and how we can create more independence and just change their lives. This experience has really allowed me to lean into mentorship and kind of really let go of that ego. Everybody's got ego. I'm not like a super egotistic person, but it can be hard to admit that, you don't know everything, and you do need to lean on your team. And so Lauren was so amazing in helping us create the protocol, because she's done DROs so many times. And, she gave us the freedom of, yes, research it yourself, make sure you're learning, but then also gave us guidance and how to help us better implement a procedure based on her experience. And Dr. Moore and Kristen weighed in. So we have these layers where we're able to ask for help. But I think as a clinician, I value that so much more going through this process than I did going through grad school. And everybody says, oh, you need a mentor, but what does that actually mean? And it's not just, oh, a mental health mentor. It's not just, oh, I want to advance in my career mentor. It's how can I be a better practitioner, is the true mentor that we all really need as a BCBA.
I think what I really hear there that's so important is I often talk to our team about separating yourself from your work product, because our work product, that's our ideas, that's our conceptualizations and analyses of behavior. And it's so important for that to go through this philosophical doubt process with this healthy skepticism. But the first thing that has to happen is you have to have a history of trust with your team that that it's not going to be something that might, kind of hit at your ego, like, oh my gosh, how could you not realize? Now, Lauren could have easily said, how could you not even consider IRT? But no, it's like, we're, as I often say, none of us has the market cornered on smarts or all behavioral analytic knowledge. And so really to say, hey, ideas that go through a process of philosophical doubt and critical thinking and skepticism become better ideas. And then we all have a part in that. And I think all of us wake up every morning saying we want to do the best job possible. And so you kind of have to separate yourself from that and trust your team to say, hey, we're all here to help. But I know we've all had the experience, whether it's in graduate school or in the workplace or in both, of that not always happening. And really recognizing, I think it's so important to recognize when you're dealing with a cynic in behavior analysis, and recognize that, hey, I'm not going to get what I need from this person, because they're more about right and wrong, and look at me, I'm smart, rather than, okay, how do we make this a better procedure for our clients? So, Lydia, how about you? You're the newest member of the team and just kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah, I always wanted to be involved in research. I mean, even in undergrad, I was like, how can I be involved? I want to do more. I want to learn more. I've always loved science. I mean, I grew up, my parents would joke that I was going to be a doctor one day, like just very into science and learning as much as I can. And then to be able to be a practitioner and to also still do research is exactly why I wanted to come to Apollo. Like, I really wanted to continue to grow my skills and to learn more and to help more people. And I love the fact that I get to actually see the direct impact that I'm making on my clients and their families, but then also be able to do it in such a way that might benefit another clinician that could then benefit other clients. Like, being able to have an impact on a lot of different people, as well as seeing the direct impact you make, is really why I love doing client-oriented research. It means a lot to me. And it's not necessarily easy, but it is, you deal with a lot of real life variables too. Like you were saying, Matt, earlier, like with my client, he had medicine changes. There was a sibling born. Like, there were a lot of other factors that you have to deal with in the moment that you can't necessarily plan for. But I love the challenge, and I like being able to figure it out, and how do we still keep it consistent and support our staff through it.
Well, I think also one of the things that occurred to me while I was listening to you talk, Lydia, is I've kind of always recognized it's like client-oriented research means you're kind of having to deal with life on life's terms, and sometimes it can wreck your methodology. But more than that, it's like these are cases that are looking at the long haul. Like, I've done both. I've done client-oriented research. I've done more traditional research. And more traditional research, it's so super intense, that you'll come in, and some studies may have only the time, that's elapsed in that study is really only 2 weeks, or maybe a month, depending on how long it takes you to get your participants in and run your sessions. And I think that the importance of client-oriented research is that maintenance over time, and how do we deal with life coming at us with life things like medicine changes, and now we got a sibling, and now we got a new dog, and now, hey, here's new therapists coming in and out all the time. So yeah, I think that a big growth step for behavior analysis will be the growth of more clinicians recognizing the value in disseminating what they're doing. That happens in medicine. It's kind of bidirectional. Yes, you have medical researchers, but doctors often are contributing on a practitioner level what they're seeing. Oftentimes, we may be the first people seeing things and asking empirical questions about them for the first time, because we're in the trenches. I tell Matt that all the time. You're in the schools, you're seeing it, man. Before anyone's even thought about it, you're seeing it. And so it's so vital there's more of us who are practitioners than are researchers. And so I think, narrowing that gap that we currently see in our field between research and practice, very important, and really helping, because there are many practitioners that are out there on the island. They don't have mentoring. They're maybe in a smaller location and don't have access to that. And we could put things in their hands that could really help them with what they're doing. So I really appreciate all three of you and the outstanding work you've done on these cases. I'm so excited and to see this kind of where we go with this and what we do, and to see now how you feel like now this is the fun part. Once we get client number 3 to the same point where client number 1 is, then we start the not so fun part, which is the writing part and the getting told, we're not as good as we think we are. That comes with peer review. That's a good but painful process. But that's also part of the process, is this dissemination. So thank you so much for what you've done. And thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to come and talk about, oftentimes we're seen as the RFT people in behavior analysis because we're doing it every day with our clients, but there's so much more. We're not excluding some more of the traditional approaches to ABA here at Apollo. So it was really fun to come on and talk about some good old-fashioned DRO.
Yeah, most definitely. And I assume, just from a housekeeping note, we can get some graphs to add to the show notes. So if people want to see a visual representation of the results of your handiwork, we can have it there over at behavioralobservations.com. This has been a fun and very relatable conversation, I think, to many of the listeners. So thank you so much for for getting together on this Friday morning here.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.